So what we're going to do in order to set this drawing up is we're not going to draw the whole plan, obviously, but what we're only going to draw is we're going to focus in on a specific area, right? And that specific area is only going to be 3 columns wide. 1, 2, 3 columns wide. So we're going to pick an area of 3 typical columns here, and that's actually maybe these are better. 3 typical columns, and that's what we're going to draw. And when we draw this, right, I'm going to ask you guys a question, and hopefully all of you answer at the same time with the same answer. What are we going to start with when we start this drawing? What's the first thing that we're going to start to draw?
The grid.
The grid.
Thank you very much. The grid. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is draw the grid. And the grid, you guys should have figured it out already in terms of what those dimensions are. All right. So let me ask you guys, who can tell me what is the spacing or what the grid dimension is between these columns here? What's the spacing between these 3 columns here? If I'm drawing the grid first. Roughly.
12 feet and 6 inches.
Yeah, roughly 12 feet, 6 inches, right? Now, if you do the math, right, you would be able to do the math up here, right, and figure out specifically what that dimension is, right? So, because now we're drawing this at a much larger scale, right, because we're drawing only a portion of this, we're not drawing the whole plan. We could fit a bigger drawing on the small piece of paper that we might be using. And I believe the scale that's on the assignment is ½ inch equals 1 foot. Okay, ½ inch equals 1 foot. So using your scale, right, it's ½ inch equals a foot. So that means it's whatever the scale is here, ½ inch. Can you focus, Mr. Camera? The camera. There we go. ½ inch equals a foot, right there. Right, ½ inch equals a foot. So whenever we're drawing anything for this specific drawing, we're going to use ½ inch equals a foot. So if we're saying that our spacing, our grid is 12 foot 6, first thing we do, draw the grid. Right, 12 foot 6. Hopefully I didn't draw that too far over. I'll measure 12 foot 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Foot 6. Oh, hopefully I didn't run out of room here. Oh, just barely. 12 foot 6. Right? So I don't know if you can see those dots that I just drew, but that's my next grid. And then here's my next grid. That's the first thing that I'm starting with. That grid. Now, a grid goes in 2 directions, right? So now I just drew the grid for this column, and I drew the grid for this column, and I drew the grid for this column. But we also have a grid that goes across here, right? Because these are column lines as well. So in this case, because I'm only drawing this one area here, I don't really have to concern myself with how far the next grid is from here. I just need to know where this grid is. And again, it's important because when we're constructing this plan detail, everything's going to come off the grid. So I will just draw a grid. Again, this is kind of a random location. It's just that it's cutting through the other column lines that I just drew. That's it. So that's my grid that establishes the grid that's here. So the area that we're going to draw is basically this area that I'm circling here. Okay, and then here is the column lines that we just drew. Right over there. Okay, and then the column line that's cutting through here. So that's what we just drew. So now, once we have that grid, what we need to do, or what we're going to do, is basically establish or transfer the outline of what this is onto our drawing. Okay?
So I have
a question. Start with the outline of that. Yes.
The middle line, does it matter where it is or no?
This one?
Yeah, because you said it just has to pass through all of the lines.
Yeah, so in this case, because we're only drawing this little section, or this little area, it doesn't really matter where we put it. We just know that it needs to cross this, right? And the fact that I don't know where to put it is more the reason why I should make myself, when I'm drawing this, that I give myself a lot of room. Because really, I could have drew it here, I could have drew it down here, but I chose to draw it here because that's just where I chose to draw it, right? You could draw it right down this middle because these lines can be a little bit longer or they could be a little bit shorter than what you need. But right now, we don't know what it is, which is why when I'm looking at your drawing and I'm looking at your construction lines, I should see sort of like, if this makes any sense, I should see sort of that little bit of imperfection because you really don't know how big this drawing is going to be until you draw it. So I'm just drawing these lines, lengthwise, like arbitrarily. Like this, if you can see, this one's a little bit longer than this one, right? I might end up having to extend this, or these might be end up way too long than what I need. But the point is that I drew them, right? And I'm demonstrating this with a big marker so that you can actually see the line. But really, I would just draw this with, a pencil, just to be able to see, where those lines are. Later on, I would go in and kind of darken them out, but I would see those lines a lot lighter initially, right? So I don't even know if you could see my pencil lines, but I would draw this as a pencil line. And then later on, if my drawing wants to have the center lines right here and only here, and these construction lines extend a little bit further, then that's fine, right? But I should see that because you really don't know how long these lines are going to be until you start drawing. So those are sort of the little telltale signs of how construction lines are being used and if they're being used properly, okay? So once we have the grid, now we can establish what the outline of this wall is. And that's basically what you're going to do for homework, right? Is to just draw the outlines of these columns that's having to do with the exterior wall using the methods that we're going to talk about now. And it's all coming back to the fact that you have to have your grid first. So once you have your grid first, we will take all of our measurements off of that grid. So if we look at this drawing again, right, and if you have it in front of you, you could follow along, right? I'm going to erase some of these lines just so it's not so confusing. Right, so if we look at this plan, we know that this building is symmetrical from the bottom to the top, right? It's the same thing down here, just the same thing up here, just that it's a mirror image, right? So if I look at one of these columns, it doesn't matter which one you look at because they're all the same. If we look at one of these columns, we can see that there's a dimension here. Does everyone have their drawing here? What is the width of this dimension of this column that extends on the outside? Anyone know what that dimension is? You should be looking at your drawings.
5 feet.
Oh.
5 feet. It's actually 5 feet 1.5, right? So we know that the center line of this column goes right through the center of that. So that's 5 feet 1.5. That means when we come to our grid here, from this center line, we could offset half of 5 foot 1.5 on both sides. And that will tell us where that edge of that line is. And I'll draw that line with a different, sorry, I'm running a little bit over, but this is important that you guys understand. So from this line, the center line, I'm going to measure half of 5 foot 1.5. So if I do the math, I'll do that here, 5 foot 1.5. That gives me 2 foot 6, and half of 1.5 is 3/4, right? So that means on either side of this column line, I'm going to measure 2 foot 6 and 3/4 of an inch. So my scale, half inch equals a foot. I will measure 2 foot 6 and 3/4. 2 foot 6 and 3/4. So that's 2 foot 6 and 3/4. This brown is a little bit dark. Let's use this orange, right? 2 foot 6 and 3/4 on that side. I'm going to measure 2 foot 6 and 3/4 on the other side. 2 foot 6 and 3/4 on the other side, right? And so that's a line that I'm going to draw a construction line of where the edge of that column wants to be. Same thing with this, 2 foot 6 and 3/4, 2 foot 6 and 3/4. Same. Again, I have no idea how big that column is right now, but I'm just drawing in my construction line. 2 foot 6 and 3/4. Again, I think I drew this a little bit too further. Oh, there we go. 2 foot 6 3/4 on this side, 2 foot 6 3/4 on this side. So that is where those columns want to be. I don't know how big they are yet, right? That's fine. I'm going to come back here and look at this drawing again, right, and draw some more construction lines. So now I'm going to try to locate where this opening is for the window, right? And some of you have done, not some of you, you all should have done this. This window is centered in between these column lines, right? Because it's centered between the columns. So what I'm going to do is find the center between these column lines so I could find the location of where that window is. I don't know how big the window is. It doesn't matter right now. Find the center. So if I know what this dimension is, I could just measure to the center. Or another trick you could do is if you take your scale and put the 0 on one of the lines and angle it so that on the other side it measures an even number like 14, right? So this side is 0, this side measures at 14, and you find the middle of those two numbers, which is 7. You put a dot there. That tells you exactly that that is the middle between those 2 points. All right, so that tells me where the middle is. That's going to be where my window location is. I don't know how big the window is yet, but that's the center of that window. The window size, now I can look either on this drawing or other parts of the drawing, but I know that that window is 5 feet wide, right? Because one, there's a similar window here, and it's dimensioned at 5 feet, all right? So I know that that's 5 feet. So if I know where the center of that window is, and I know the window is 5 feet wide, again, I'm measuring to either side of that, 2 foot 6, 2 foot 6 to both sides. 2 foot 5 feet here. So then that is another construction line of where the edge of that window wants to be. And I could do the same thing here, right? So I'm going to do this quickly on this side, 14. Again, I'm doing this freehand. You guys would be scaling this and using a straight edge, right? 2 foot 6, 2 foot 6. Right? Again, all I have is a bunch of construction lines here. Lines of the edge of the column, lines of the edge of the window. Now I want to establish this dimension of where those columns and that wall want to be. And again, I'm only referring to this drawing now. If I look at this drawing and I look over to this edge, this corner, right, I can see here that there is a dimension of, I don't know if you can see it here, but there's a dimension of this return, this side, as 3 feet. And I also see a dimension here for the width of this wall at 5 feet. Right, so that means this total thickness here between the outside of this column and the inside of the wall is 5 feet. All right, so that means my center line between this column, if this whole wall, this whole section here, this whole column section here is 5 feet, that means the center line is basically 2.5 feet right down the middle. So this is the center line of that column. And again, I'll measure 2.5 feet down, 2.5 feet up to tell me where the top edge of that wall is and the bottom edge. And again, I'm drawing the mirror image. I'm drawing it down here. I'm drawing this configuration, not up there. I'm just happens to be that the dimensions are up on that side, right? So take my center line, measure 2.5 feet, measure 2.5 feet up. And then again, maybe I'll use my roller ruler here so that you can see it. So I'll take my roller ruler, line it up with my center line, roll this down. Again, draw a guideline across. Again, my roller ruler is a little bit, and again, I started drawing this not straight, so my roller ruler is also not long enough to draw all the way across. So I draw those lines all the way across. This gives me this edge of the column. It also gives me the inside edge of this column. So now I know that from this edge to the thickness of the wall is 2 feet, and also from here it's 3 feet. So I could measure either way. From here I can measure 3 feet, which puts that line there, or I can measure 2 feet from this side. And again, drew this not to scale, so to speak, or I drew it to scale, but I'm drawing this freehand, so it's not lining up exactly. But so I measured this 3 feet. Let's see, 1, 2, 3 feet roughly. Right, so that means this line, right, is the outside line of this outside wall right here. So I would draw this line across. And then this line is the line of the inside edge of the wall. Now I got a lot of lines over here, right? It might be a little bit confusing, but that's okay as long as I'm consistent about what I'm drawing. So let's start the center column here. So once I have the center column located and I have all these construction lines, now I could go back in with my darker pencil to kind of darken these lines out to make them more apparent. So here I know is the edge of the window. This is the edge of the column. So I will come from here, right, which is the inside, the outside face of the wall. That's my wall. That's my column. That's the outside face of the column. That comes in, right? And then it comes out, right? It meets the shoulder where the window is. So that's going to come out, and that's going to come in, which is where the window is. And this is going to come all the way to the other side of the window opening, just here. And this is going to drop down and come across. So that's one column right there. Same thing on this side. Once I have these construction lines drawn, then it's a lot easier for me to come back in and finish up the rest of this. But again, I'm not drawing this in its entirety, right? I set up all of these construction lines. And actually what I just did was wrong, in that I should have drew all of these lines together. I should have drew all these lines together in one shot because my paraliner, my straight edge, is already set up to make that line. So I might as well draw all of those together. Here, again, the shoulder, 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 shoulder. The outside face of the column, outside face of the column, outside face of the column. Vertically, right, shoulder, the edge of the column, shoulder, edge of the column, shoulder, edge of the column, so on and so forth. Exactly the same thing. So now I have, oh, I should have extended this over, complete that, right? So now I basically have 3 outlines of my columns with my column center lines, right? And again, this could extend further if I didn't know exactly how far it was, right? My column center lines, right? And then from there, we can then fill in the information that belongs on the inside of this. Because now we're going to start off with the outline, because that's what we had to start with. When you're designing the building, you kind of have a sense of what that wall wants to be, and then you'll add in the details. So from here, what we're going to do next week is add detail to this. Add, just like we were talking about when you're going out in the cold and you're layering your clothing, we're going to layer in the clothing, the clothing of this building, right? So right now we just have the outline of what we want, what we have. We're going to fill in the liner. We're going to fill in the down filling, the fleece, right? The long sleeve T-shirt, you know, the undershirt. We're going to layer all that stuff in next week after we have a discussion of what those layers are. We talked about the masonry, right? We talked a little bit about the air gap, but next week the focus is going to be mostly on, you know, what are the components of that layers, what that layer is. So what I want everyone to do for homework, in addition to the reading, is basically get this drawing done. And when I say get the drawing done, just basically what I have here, right, is to have the grid, construct it exactly what we did from the dimensions of your plan. And remember, it's a larger scale drawing. It's 1/2 inch equals a foot. You could measure this to the nearest, literally 3/4 of an inch, right? So if its dimension is, you know, 2 foot, what did I say? 2'6" 3/4, which is the distance between here, right? 2'6" 3/4 is this. You should be able to fairly accurately, with a, you know, a good pencil, your sharpened pencil, measure 2'6" 3/4. You should be using complete dimensions like that. all right, with fractions of an inch. You won't be able to measure to the nearest eighth of an inch, obviously, but 3/4, you should be pretty darn close. To get this outline, because we'll be building upon this. You don't have to draw in such dark outlines. It could be darkened a little bit, but you don't have to go overboard because we're going to be adding layers to this. If you want to do this on trace paper, again, you could do this on trace paper and just use that as a layout for what we do after this. But you should get this done for next week because we're going to be building on this next week. All right, so that will be your homework.